Nearly 30 years after its release, Blaster Master remains one of the most fondly remembered games of the NES era, and for many Western fans, it was the game that put developer Sunsoft on the map. With an inviting blend of side-scrolling and top-down action, Blaster Master was an ambitious game for its day, but one that never really received a truly great sequel. So when it was announced that a new Blaster Master game was being released under the Sunsoft banner, we were both excited and skeptical. So in honor of this new release, it's time to celebrate Blaster Master. We're going to reflect back on what it is that made this game so special, both in terms of design and in its usage of the NES hardware. We're also going to examine Blaster Master Zero and see how it stacks up against the original game, before finishing up with a look at its less successful sequels. Let's get started. Released in 1988, the original Blaster Master hit right as NES Mania was in full swing. Combining tight action, multiple genres, and smart programming into a single game, Blaster Master stood out in a big way. At least in the West. The original release in Japan, known as Chowakusei Senki Meta Fight, wasn't exactly a huge success after all, to the point where the game's creator Yoshiaki Iwata was completely unaware of its popularity overseas at the time. But popular it was. Keep in mind that although the Famicom had been released back in 1983, it took years for the system to become available around the world, and it wasn't really until 1987 or so that the system became the phenomenon we all remember. 1988, though, is when many of the system's most memorable games were first released. From Mega Man 2 and Bionic Commando, to Contra, Metal Gear, and of course, Blaster Master. It was a great time to be playing games. At its core, Blaster Master is split between side-scrolling action stages and top-down shooting stages. While side-scrolling, you pilot Sophia the Third, known as Metal Attacker in Meta Fight, and you spend most of your time jumping and blasting away at enemies in all directions. Your objective is to ultimately find the exit in each stage, but getting there requires you to explore intricate non-linear levels, discover power-ups, and fight giant bosses. One of the key innovations centers on the ability to hop out of your tank at any time, by pressing the select button. On foot, your character is less powerful, but your smaller size makes it possible to go where the tank cannot. This is where the overhead stages come into play. Entry points are scattered around each level, and you'll need to explore these areas in order to find the boss. Defeat that boss and you'll gain a new power-up for Sophia, which you can then use to bypass roadblocks as you make your way to the next stage. This aspect gives the game an almost puzzle-like quality, since victory requires you to figure out how to get your tank through each environment while surviving in combat. Of course, we can't talk about Blaster Master without mentioning its crazy narrative, which follows your character Jason as he follows his pet frog named Fred into a large hole that opened up in his backyard. This is where Jason first encounters the tank Sophia the Third, which he commandeers in search of Fred. All of this and more is chronicled in the first Worlds of Power book based on Blaster Master. The narrative and the associated intro sequence were specifically created for the Western release of the game and share nothing with Meta Fight on the Famicom. Even this introduction sequence is modified between the two. Another memorable aspect of the game is of course its music. In what would become the norm for 8-bit Sunsoft games, Blaster Master features an incredible soundtrack with memorable tunes that really get you into the action. And all of this was made possible by smart programming and design decisions. It was around this time that we started seeing a greater number of technically advanced NES games, and Blaster Master is one of the best of its era. Support for extremely large stages complete with multi-directional scrolling, smart palette usage, robust object handling, and more all contributed to the experience. You have to keep in mind that the NES itself was simple hardware created during an era of single-screen arcade games. It was only with time that developers found ways around these limitations in order to create much more complex games. One key advantage was support for hardware scrolling, which enables the system to smoothly scroll pixel by pixel between multiple different screens. These screens were stored using name tables, which reference relevant tile data when drawing the level. The system could hold 4 screens worth of data stored in a 2x2 matrix, but due to its limited 2 kilobytes of onboard memory, only 2 of these screens could be unique, while the others were simply mirrored duplicates. New data could be loaded into these off-screen buffers, which could then enable developers to create the illusion of larger worlds. Most NES games of this era were designed to scroll in one direction at a time, with the playfield being just one screen tall or wide. For best results, developers often used vertical mirroring for horizontal scrolling and vice versa. Though titles like Mega Man 3 or Super Mario Bros. 3 sometimes inverted this to pull off cool tricks, like the status bar scroll here in Mega Man, or the airship sections in Mario 3, which looked as if they were actually moving through the air. Mario 3 of course supports multi-directional scrolling, but there are visible artifacts along the border of the screen due to its implementation, something Blaster Master manages to avoid. Now, multi-directional scrolling was still somewhat uncommon at this point on the NES, but it can actually be traced back to 1986 with The Legend of Kage. Of course, Blaster Master is a huge improvement there, with huge detailed levels that could be multiple screens wide by multiple screens tall, all while avoiding typical artifacts along the edge of the screen. To fit these large levels within the limited memory of the system and pull this off, Blaster Master relied heavily on metatile clusters. What is that? Well, first consider that the NES supports 2 layers, a sprite layer and a background layer. This background layer used tiles consisting of an 8x8 pixel region filled with character data. By grouping tiles together into a single block, you could save memory versus referencing every tile one by one. These blocks are generally referred to as metatiles. Blaster Master, of course, uses massive metatiles composed of smaller metatiles, enabling the system to display large level chunks using less overall memory. The limitation here is less granularity in design, since you can't edit individual blocks on a per tile basis, but the level designers were skillful enough in placement that it doesn't wind up feeling much different in terms of quality compared to other NES games. Each tile is also limited to just 4 colors, which can become problematic with larger metatiles, but smart design saves the day here. This metatile block here features both grass and dirt materials, for instance, but by sharing the whitish gray color between both grass and dirt, these materials take on a sheen without going over color budget. The sprite work is also impressive. For instance, Sophia is composed of 6 8x8 tiles, allowing things like the wheels and body to move separately, which also works into that subtle feeling of suspension the game brings. That said, due to its multi-directional nature, sprites can appear from all directions, and this highlights a weakness in the way the game handles sprites. It's not possible for a sprite in this game to appear partially on screen, so there is obvious pop-in present as enemies are drawn to the scene. Speaking of enemies, another cool feature is the semi-persistent nature of enemy destruction. In many games, if you kill an enemy, scroll back a screen, and then return to your original position, the enemy will reappear. It was pretty common in games like Mega Man and Ninja Gaiden. In Blaster Master, however, killing an enemy removes them from the playfield until you enter one of the overhead stages. So during normal traversal, you can freely move all throughout the world and enemies will remain wiped out until you leave the map. A neat little feature, I think. Bosses were interesting as well, since the developers wanted to feature huge creatures, but the NES wasn't really well suited for this. So in order to pull this off, they used the old trick of blanking out the background and creating the boss from background tiles instead, while using the multi-scroll feature to give the impression that it's moving around. Ultimately, Blaster Master was an important game for the NES, which looked and played differently from just about anything else on the system at the time. Thanks to its popularity then, Blaster Master would go on to receive a number of spin-offs and sequels, but I wanted to start with the most recent one first, Blaster Master Zero. After all, this might be the first and only time that we can compare a game on Nintendo's very first console, the NES, to a game on its newest one, the Switch. Blaster Master Zero was released for the Nintendo Switch just 1 week after launch in the West and day and date with the console in Japan. This time, Inti Creates has collaborated with what's left of Sunsoft to create what feels almost like a re-envisioning of the original game. It looks and feels like an authentic Blaster Master experience, only taken to the next level. There's a unique hybrid of visual techniques on display here where we see things like a harsh limit on colors per tile, combined with advanced parallax scrolling that would make 16-bit systems jealous. At its core, the design of the game remains much the same. You're still platforming through large side-scrolling zones while finding goodies hidden in the overhead stages. This time, there are new power-ups and items to find, which encourages you to spend more time exploring the world since it's no longer just about finding the boss. Controls are improved now, even allowing Sophia to fire at an angle. There's even a new map system here, as well as save points. It's certainly an easier game than the NES original, but it still puts up a good challenge. Amazingly, aspects of the original narrative remain here. You still play as Jason, and you're still chasing after Fred, only this time it's in the name of science. The story sequences definitely add some character, and are short enough to avoid getting in the way. When you stack it up against the original game then, it immediately becomes clear that a lot of changes have been made to the visuals. Sophia now has an idle animation, for instance. Grass blows in the wind, detailed backgrounds fill the environment, and when you hit the ground, little plumes of smoke and dust are kicked up. Parallax scrolling has also been added to the game with a huge number of layers that can overlap smoothly. This feature alone adds a tremendous amount of depth to the game's visuals. Once you jump into the top-down maps then, things improve further with greatly enhanced sprite work and fleshed out visuals. It certainly helps give these areas some additional character. Boss sections are also playable without having to blank out the background as we see on the NES. And of course, while we're thinking about bosses, the old fire grenade and pause trick, that doesn't work anymore. And of course, it also runs more smoothly. The original game operates at 60 frames per second, but many scenes trigger significant slowdown. That's not the case here with Blaster Master Zero though, which delivers a perfectly stable frame rate. Now, Blaster Master Zero is also available on 3DS, and unfortunately I wasn't able to capture it, but from what I understand, it's limited to 30 frames per second just like Azure Striker Gunvolt. Unfortunately, the Switch version also has an issue. It uses non-integer scaling. I covered something similar back in my Symphony of the Night episode, where every fourth pixel was exactly one extra pixel wide, which led to distorted artwork. In this case, the resulting artifacts from this improper scale produce noticeable shimmering and distortion while the game is scrolling. It's distracting enough in docked mode at 1080p, but it becomes even more noticeable when playing the Switch in portable mode. Getting back to the positive, we have the soundtrack. The main theme is here, but most of the music is original. What's interesting though is that all of the music has been created to sound quite like audio produced by something like the Sunsoft 5B audio chip that was used in games such as Gimmick. It sounds richer and features more audio channels than was possible on a normal NES. Ultimately, Blaster Master Zero is exactly the kind of follow-up that I had been waiting for. For my money, this is now the best Blaster Master game ever released. Okay, so if Blaster Master and Zero are the best of the best, what's up with the rest? Well, first, in 1991, Sunsoft released Blaster Master Boy, or Junior depending on your region. This is a strange one, and you can kinda see why. It doesn't really look a whole lot like Blaster Master, does it? That's because this ICOM developed game is actually a sequel to a game called Bomber King, which itself is a spin-off of Hudson's Bomberman. That's not to say it doesn't feel anything like Blaster Master. The gameplay resembles the top-down sections from the original, and your character does have a blaster at their disposal. The main attack, of course, comes in the form of bombs, which you drop just like in Bomberman. You're basically tasked with making your way through various stages using a mix of bombs and blasters while dealing with hazards. It's not an especially impressive title for the Game Boy, but it's not without positives. The way in which the environment is destroyed, for instance, looks pretty cool as it leaves chunks of tiles behind rather than just eliminating the stage on a block-by-block basis. And even with all of these explosions happening, the game still manages to run pretty well on the Game Boy. All in all, not a bad game, but not really a Blaster Master title. Next up, we have Blaster Master 2, perhaps the most disappointing release in the series. This installment was not developed internally by Sunsoft. Instead, software creations of Plock fame took over the series. And at first glance, it looks pretty good. It's colorful, there's some nice sprite work, it runs smoothly, there's some potential here. But then you pick up the controller, and it immediately becomes evident that something isn't quite right. Blaster Master 2 does not play well. In an attempt to make things more realistic, your tank now has more weight, but feels less responsive. You now bounce off of walls, which can be incredibly infuriating, and your turret must also be manually adjusted between different positions by tapping up and down on the D-pad. And the most annoying thing of all has to be the needless complication of button presses. Want to get out of your tank? Hold down on the D-pad and press C. Same thing to get back in. Want to enter a door? Hold up on the D-pad and press A. Okay, that doesn't sound so bad, but the problem is that when you're in the middle of combat, and there is a lot of combat, none of these button presses come naturally, and it always feels as if you're not entirely in control of your tank. Spot-on controls were a hallmark of the original game, and they are all but gone here. Then there's the level design. It's not inherently bad per se, but it's not really interesting either. The real issue for me is the enemy placement and constant respawning. Everything can kill you in this game, and enemies are constantly appearing on screen from all directions. Right from the start, you know something is up here when you encounter a bee and it decides to hover right on top of your tank as you are sitting on a platform, exactly where you can't shoot it. Then you go inside and it's just enemies and turrets hitting you constantly, while bats fly down from above and drops of cave water absolutely wreck your vehicle. The overhead Jason stages are gone now as well, instead replaced with these small boss fights, which again aren't very fun due to the bad pattern design on display here. Oh, and when you do finish a stage, there is still an overhead section. It's just that you control Sophia in these sections, and it feels kind of terrible. You have to manually rotate your turret using the B and C buttons while changing directions as you clumsily navigate a maze looking for a way out. Snappier controls and better enemy placement are all they really needed here to make a somewhat better game, but as it is, it's just not very fun. As for the presentation, well, it looks nice enough, but the system's background layers aren't really put to good use here, as the team simply slapped a static image onto the parallax layer and called it a day. No line scrolling, no advanced parallax, nothing, just a flat background that never moves. At least the color usage is pretty good. Then we have the music, one of the best parts of the original game, and yet again, Blaster Master 2 falls short. Just listen to this. It has that harsh metallic sound that's really common in Western developed Genesis games, but to counter that, I wanted to remind everyone that the system really can produce much more pleasing audio, something like this for example. Much better, right? Okay, that's about all I can take of Blaster Master 2 right now, so let's move on. Next up is a much better effort, Blaster Master Enemy Below. Released in 2000 on the Game Boy Color, Enemy Below is the first sequel thus far that actually manages to capture the look and feel of Blaster Master. It shares sprite and tile work with the NES original, and at first glance, it looks like an actual remake. But it most certainly is not. The entire game has been reworked with a completely new set of maps and changes made to progression. The maps are more confusing than before and now require you to explore overhead sections for a key before you can even access the boss. It plays rather well and looks pretty good for a Game Boy title, but the smaller screen combined with the maze-like environments makes it rather difficult to get a handle on level layouts. They also removed the scrolling feature between rooms, which could just be a hardware limitation. For those curious, here's how it stacks up against the original NES version. It looks rather similar, no doubt, but I do like the addition of the tree tiles into the background here on Game Boy. But this also highlights the issue I mentioned before, where the sprite work and tile work is simply too large for a game like this, and you end up with a super zoomed in view of the action, which was a very common problem on the Game Boy. The music is all based on the original game as well, but lacks the fidelity of the NES version. Take a listen. It's a neat version of Blaster Master, and at the time of its release, it was probably the second best attempt at bringing the franchise back. Next up is a pair of releases for the PlayStation. Let's start with the one most people will be familiar with, Blaster Master Blasting Again. This was a very late release for the PS1, but it's an interesting game nonetheless. Keep in mind that this was released after the next generation consoles were already available, leaving it look a little bit dated. But if you give it a chance and look beyond its chunky exterior, you'll find a great translation of Blaster Master into 3D. The spirit of the game remains the same. You're exploring a massive non-linear environment, primarily in your tank, while searching for on-foot levels required to make progress. It takes some time to get used to, no doubt, but the controls actually wind up feeling pretty good. The sense of moving around the world is handled remarkably well, and it's great blasting away at enemies. There's a real sense of weight here that actually works really well in 3D. Initially, the game can look a little bit confusing, but the map system is pretty good at helping you understand where you need to go. Now, it does feel like a game from that era, no doubt, but it's still a ton of fun. It's also not without problems, however. For instance, every time you leave a room, the game has to drop to a brief loading screen. They're short enough to avoid becoming a bigger problem, but it still takes something away from the experience, especially during the on-foot sections, which are even smaller. The visuals are also rather dark with plenty of color dithering and jittery textures, and the frame rate isn't always the best. Considering the release date of the game, it's a shame that it wasn't shifted over to the PlayStation 2 during development, where it could have made a stronger impression. It of course has a soundtrack that is characteristic of games from that era, and it's not bad. So if you haven't played it, I definitely think it's worth checking out, especially since you can play all PlayStation 1 discs on PS1, 2, and 3 consoles. Now the other Blaster Master game on PlayStation is something a little different. It's a port of the original Metafight Famicom game, and it was released on Sunsoft Memorial Volume 4, a series of discs which compiled a number of great Sunsoft games on a single disc for PS1 owners. Unfortunately, it's not an especially great port. It feels like a half-baked emulation attempt. The game plays fine, no doubt, but the selected color palette is on the garish side with very bright, harsh colors. But if that were the only issue, it would be just fine, as the game does run and play just as you would expect. But unfortunately, they missed one key element: sound emulation. Yeah, it just doesn't sound very good at all. It's not unlistenable or anything, but it definitely does not stack up against the NES original soundtrack. Still, it's neat that this game exists in another form, and it's a pretty obscure release too, difficult to come by, so I wouldn't advise hunting it down unless you just have to own every version of the game. Which brings us to our final Blaster Master game, Blaster Master Overdrive for the Wii. As a 35 megabyte WiiWare download, the original director returned to work on this game. As such, there was a lot of promise behind it and a decent amount of hype, but in the end, it didn't quite live up to expectations. Now, to its credit, the game plays pretty well, It's very faithful to the original, and the controls are responsive and crisp. It definitely feels good to play, so it's not a bad game. It's just that it has two pretty serious problems that really hold it back: the presentation and level design. Presentation-wise, both the audio and visual side of things fail to impress. The visuals consist of dreary-looking artwork that sort of melds together into a messy overall-looking game. It has very little sense of style and no real character. It kind of feels like a generic mid-90s game that you might find on a PC Gamer demo disc. Parallax backgrounds are included at least, but again, they're just kind of messy and off-putting. The design of your vehicle also makes it difficult to tell which way it's facing. All in all, it's really just not an attractive looking game. And the same kind of goes for the soundtrack. It sounds like a generic remixed version of the NES game. Nothing about these tunes stands out, and it just winds up feeling as ho-hum as the visuals. Beyond that, the level design just isn't very interesting. You spend a lot of time wandering through ugly looking maps trying to figure out where to go next, but the drab presentation kind of drags things down, making it difficult to put up with these confusing levels. So taken as a whole then, Blaster Master Overdrive, not a bad game, but it does feel rather uninspired. But after revisiting all of these games in the span of a week, I feel that the two best successors to the original game are Blaster Master Zero and Blasting Again. Each brings the spirit of Blaster Master to the table while offering great controls and interesting level design. One of them strives to do it in 2 dimensions, while the other goes for something different. There's still a lot of potential in this formula, and I wouldn't mind seeing a development team try to do it in 3D again, with a modern engine. As for the original, does it still hold up today? Well, I think that's a question you have to answer for yourself, but for my money, I still had a lot of fun playing it. The concept remains fresh, and the controls are crisp and satisfying. The overhead sections have aged somewhat poorly in comparison to the rest of the game, but the experience is still worth having. And with that, we've come to the end of this episode. Hopefully you've enjoyed this look back at the series as much as I did. And if you did enjoy it, be sure to like, subscribe, and follow us on Twitter. And until next time, stay retro.